Zara Banks sat perfectly still before James Montgomery's imposing desk, her fingers intertwined so tightly they'd begun to lose feeling. The luxurious leather chair beneath her felt foreign against her skin, cold, unwelcoming, as though the very furniture knew she didn't belong. James hadn't looked up from his documents, the rhythmic scratching of his gold-tipped pen against paper, cutting through the silence like a blade, each stroke driving her anxiety deeper. Finally, James set his pen down with deliberate precision and leaned back, his steel-blue eyes meeting hers with a calculating gaze that she'd once mistaken for interest. "Zara," he said, his voice deceptively calm, pulling her further into this moment that would forever divide her life into before and after. "I assume this isn't about work." Zara's heart hammered against her ribcage, each beat echoing in her ears. She'd rehearsed this conversation countless times in the sanctuary of her mind, but now, as reality crystallized around her, words seemed to evaporate on her tongue. She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of what she was about to say. "No, it's not," she admitted softly, gaze dropping to her hands as if they held some secret strength. "I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was suffocating, expanding to fill every corner of the room. James remained perfectly still, his face an impenetrable mask. The seconds stretched into an eternity, each one heavier than the last, until finally he spoke. "I see." 2 words, nothing more. Zara blinked, her heart continuing its frantic rhythm. "It's yours, James," she added, fighting to keep her voice steady, to maintain whatever dignity remained. "I thought you should know." James sighed, leaning forward, elbows coming to rest on his mahogany desk as he steepled his fingers before him. The gesture looked rehearsed, as though he'd practiced this moment of calculated disappointment. "Zara," he began, his tone cool and precise, "this is unfortunate." "Unfortunate?" Her voice wavered, disbelief seeping into every syllable. She had expected shock, anger perhaps, but this clinical indifference cut deeper than rage ever could. "Yes," James said, meeting her gaze directly now, his expression hardening like cement setting around her. "You should have been more careful." Her stomach twisted painfully, nausea rising that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. We were careful." "Clearly not careful enough," he replied, his words slicing through her like Arctic wind. He leaned back again, eyes narrowing slightly. "And now you're telling me because you what? Expect me to do something about it?" Zara's throat constricted painfully. She hadn't thought this far ahead, hadn't prepared for this glacial response. "I thought you'd want to know," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought maybe we could figure something out." James's face hardened, transforming before her eyes into something unrecognizable. "Figure something out? Zara, you know how these things work. I'm married. I have a family, a reputation. This," he gestured between them, dismissing whatever connection they'd shared with a flick of his wrist, "was never supposed to be anything more than what it was." The words hit her with physical force, knocking the air from her lungs. She had been a fool, she realized that now, with devastating clarity. The late nights in his office, whispered promises, stolen moments. She had allowed herself to believe it was something real, something meaningful. But to him, it had always been disposable. She had always been disposable. Zara straightened her spine, gathering the last fragments of her courage. "I'm keeping the baby, James," he sighed again, standing up from his desk and walking around to position himself before her, not close enough to offer comfort, but close enough to intimidate. "I can't be involved in this, Zara, you know that." His voice was firm, but unnervingly calm. "This conversation, it never happened. Understand?" Her blood crystallized in her veins. "What? You're just walking away?" "I have to," he said, his voice steady as a surgeon's hand. "You should too." Zara stood up, righteous anger beginning to burn in her chest, warming her from the inside out. "I can't just walk away from this, James. It's your child too." James's jaw tightened, a fleeting crack in his composed facade. "Zara, I'm warning you. Let this go. I've taken care of you, but if you make this a problem for me, I'll make sure you regret it." Her heart plummeted, a free fall into darkness. "What are you saying?" He didn't answer immediately, simply returning to his throne behind the desk. He sat back down. His expression was glacial. "I'm saying this is your last day at Montgomery Enterprises." Zara froze, the world tilting beneath her feet. "What?" "You'll be discreetly let go. I've already spoken with HR." His tone was businesslike, impersonal, as though discussing the termination of a manufacturing contract rather than a human life, two human lives. "You'll get a severance package, of course, but after today you're no longer an employee here." The words crashed over her like a physical blow. "You're firing me because I'm pregnant? Because of you?" "I'm protecting my family, Zara, and you should protect yourself." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that seemed to curl around her throat. "If you try to come after me, I'll make sure you never work in this industry again." Zara's hands trembled, fury and disbelief warring inside her as the full impact of his threat registered. She stood frozen, staring at the man she had once trusted. The man who now regarded her as a threat to be neutralized. She swallowed back the lump forming in her throat. "I never thought you'd do this." "You never should have thought anything else," James replied, his voice calm as though they were discussing the weather rather than the systematic destruction of her life. Zara's vision blurred with unshed tears, but she blinked them away fiercely. She wouldn't cry in front of him. She wouldn't grant him that final satisfaction. Without another word, she turned and walked out of his office, her movements mechanical, divorced from thought. Her legs carried, her back to her desk as though on autopilot, her hands methodically packing her belongings. Each item she placed in her bag seemed to weigh more than the last, physical manifestations of dreams turning to dust. In the elevator down to the lobby, she stared at her reflection in the polished walls, trying to hold herself together while, inside, she was fracturing along invisible fault lines. Her job, her future, her security, all had been ripped away in a matter of minutes, leaving her adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The tears finally fell when she stepped out onto the street, becoming just another face in the crowd. No one would ever know the truth. James Montgomery had made certain of that, but as she walked away from the building that had once held her future, she placed a protective hand on her stomach where a new life was beginning to grow. She wasn't alone. She still had her child, and, somehow, they would survive. The morning light filtered through the blinds in Marcus's bedroom, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floor. He stood before the mirror, adjusting his deep blue tie for the 5th time, his fingers working with nervous precision. It was his first day at Montgomery Enterprises, and anticipation buzzed beneath his skin like electricity. "Looking sharp," he murmured to himself, shoulders pulling back, as he summoned confidence from somewhere deep within. From the kitchen, the gentle sound of water beginning to boil broke the silence. Marcus could hear his mother moving about, preparing for her day with the quiet efficiency that had defined his childhood. He smiled to himself, imagining how proud she'd be once he returned home with stories of his first day. He checked his phone 5 minutes until he had to leave, just enough time to receive his mother's blessing for what lay ahead. Walking into the kitchen, he found Zara already seated at their small round table, her slender hands wrapped around a steaming mug. She looked up when he entered, offering a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mom, how do I look?" Marcus grinned, turning slowly to display his carefully chosen suit. "First day at Montgomery Enterprises. This is big, right?" Zara nodded slowly, her fingers visibly tightening around the mug. "Yes, Marcus." "It's big." Marcus stopped mid-turn, something in her voice throwing him off balance. The excitement he'd expected to see reflected in her eyes wasn't there. Instead, he saw something that looked remarkably like fear. "You okay, Mom?" he asked, dropping into the chair across from her. You don't seem as happy about this as I thought you'd be." Zara's eyes fell to the steam rising from her tea, avoiding his questioning gaze. "I am happy for you. I don't know about that place." Marcus's brow furrowed, confusion spreading across his features. "What do you mean?" "It's Montgomery Enterprises, one of the top financial firms in the country. This could be huge for me, for us." "I know, baby," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But that place? It's not what you think." He stared at her, bewilderment deepening. "What do you mean? Did you know someone who worked there? Is that why you're worried?" Zara's hand tightened around the mug until her knuckles whitened, her lips pressing into a thin line. For a moment, Marcus thought she might reveal something significant, but instead she just shook her head, her gaze still fixed on the swirling tea as though it contained answers she couldn't give. "It's nothing like that. I just want you to be careful, that's all." Marcus leaned back in his chair, trying to make sense of her sudden shift in a mood. His mother had always been his greatest champion, pushing him to aim higher, telling him he could achieve anything with dedication and hard work. But now, when he stood on the precipice of something momentous, she seemed to be pulling back, creating distance he couldn't understand. "Careful?" he repeated, frustration edging into his voice. "Mom, this is what we've been working toward for years. I didn't go through all that schooling and those internships for nothing. This job could change everything for us." "I know," she said, finally looking up at him, her eyes shadowed with something that looked unmistakably like dread. "But not everything is what it seems." Marcus frowned, leaning forward. "What's going on, Mom? Why are you saying all this now? You were excited when I first told you about the job." Zara hesitated again, and Marcus felt the tension between them thicken, become almost tangible. Something unspoken hung in the air between them, something weighty and significant that he couldn't quite grasp. "I just don't want you to get hurt," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "Some places have shadows, Marcus, things you don't see until it's too late." Marcus's frown deepened, confusion turning to concern. "Shadows? Mom, it's a job, an opportunity. I'm not some kid walking into danger. This is going to help us. It's going to help you." Zara's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, she looked so much older than he'd ever seen her, as though carrying a burden that had been invisibly weighing her down for years. "Just be careful, Marcus. Promise me." He softened, seeing the genuine worry etched into the lines of her face, though he still couldn't understand its source. "I'll be careful, I promise, but you've got to trust me. I've worked hard for this, and I'm not going to let anything mess it up." She nodded, though the worry never left her expression. "I trust you, Marcus. I always have." He stood, checking his watch with a practiced glance. "I've got to head out. I'll call you later, okay?" Zara smiled, though it was thin, as though the expression cost her something precious. "Good luck, baby." Marcus kissed her on the forehead before grabbing his briefcase and heading toward the door. But just before stepping out, he glanced back at her, still sitting at the table, staring down into her tea, her face drawn and tense. For the first time, doubt flickered in his chest, but he shook it off quickly. This was his moment, his opportunity, and nothing was going to stop him from seizing it. The subway ride into the financial district felt electric with possibility. Marcus stood in the crowded car, gripping the pole. As the train lurched forward, his thoughts racing ahead to the day that would unfold. This was everything he had worked for, the first step toward a successful career, and he refused to let his mother's cryptic warnings cloud his judgment. Montgomery Enterprises was a prestigious name in the industry. They didn't hire just anyone, and he had beaten out hundreds of applicants to secure this position. If his mother was worried, it was probably just maternal concern, perhaps even a touch of separation anxiety. After all, this job represented a significant change, a step toward independence she might not be fully prepared for. He would talk to her about it later, when her nerves had settled. Stepping out of the subway station, Marcus paused at the foot of the Montgomery Enterprises building. The glass tower soared above him, sleek and commanding, the morning sunlight reflecting off its mirrored surface, making it shimmer like a mirage on the horizon. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and felt a surge of determination rise within him. This is it, he thought. This is where everything begins. Inside, the lobby was grand and imposing, filled with the quiet buzz of professionals moving with purpose. Marcus checked in with the receptionist, and within minutes he was being escorted upstairs by his supervisor, Miss Harper, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a quicker stride. "Welcome aboard, Marcus," she said, as they stepped into the elevator. "We're expecting great things from you." "Thank you, ma'am," Marcus replied, nervousness giving way to excitement once more. "I'm ready to get started." Miss Harper gave him a brief, assessing nod. "Good. Let's hope you live up to your potential." They walked through the office, a labyrinth of cubicles and glass-walled meeting rooms. Everything looked pristine, high-tech, designed to impress. People were focused intensely on their work, barely glancing up as Marcus passed by. He could feel the pressure to perform, the unspoken demand for excellence that permeated the very air. As they moved through the floor, Marcus spotted him, James Montgomery, the CEO himself, engaged in conversation with a group of senior executives. Marcus couldn't help the surge of admiration that rose within him. This was the man who had built the company from nothing, who embodied everything Marcus aspired to achieve. But as they passed, James's gaze flickered toward him. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Marcus felt an inexplicable chill. James's expression didn't change. It remained neutral, professional. But there was something in his eyes, a brief flicker of recognition, almost like a shadow passing over still water. Then it was gone. James turned back to his conversation, without a second glance. Marcus continued walking, dismissing the strange feeling as nerves. James Montgomery didn't know him. He was just another new hire among many. Still, something about that look lingered in the back of his mind as Miss Harper showed him to his desk and outlined his first assignments. As the day progressed, Marcus threw himself into his work, the thrill of new beginnings, pushing aside any lingering doubts. This was where he belonged, and he was determined to prove himself worthy of the opportunity. But even as he immersed himself in his tasks, his mother's words echoed persistently in his mind. "Some places have shadows, Marcus, things you don't see until it's too late." He shook his head, trying to clear the thought. He wasn't in any danger. He was here to succeed, to build a future. Whatever shadows his mother feared couldn't touch him. Not here, not now. The office had settled into a steady rhythm by mid-morning, a quiet hum of keyboards and murmured conversations filling the open space. Marcus sat at his new desk, fingers flying across the keys as he familiarized himself with the company's systems. Miss Harper had given him a substantial stack of documents to review, and while the work was straightforward, the weight of expectation pressed down on him like a physical force. Montgomery Enterprises was clearly a place where mediocrity was not tolerated. But no matter how diligently he tried to focus, his thoughts kept drifting back to that brief moment in the hallway. James Montgomery's eyes locking with his for just a heartbeat, that flicker of something, recognition, suspicion. Marcus frowned, flipping through the pages of the report before him. It didn't make sense. James Montgomery couldn't possibly know him. He was just another face in a company that likely employed hundreds, if not thousands. He pushed the thought aside attributing it to first-day nerves. Marcus had always been prone to overthinking, especially when the stakes were high. He needed to concentrate to prove himself worthy of this opportunity. Lunchtime came and went. Marcus ate quickly at his desk, unwilling to waste even a minute of productive time. He'd heard that Montgomery Enterprises was a cutthroat environment where people were judged solely by their efficiency and output. He wasn't about to fall behind on his first day. The reports he'd been assigned were dense with financial jargon, but he plowed through them methodically, determined to make a favorable impression. Yet, as the afternoon wore on, that strange feeling from earlier kept resurfacing like a splinter beneath his skin, small but persistently uncomfortable. It wasn't until later, when Miss Harper came by to check on his progress, that the unease crystallized into something more concrete. "You're doing well, Marcus," she observed, glancing over his shoulder at the screen. "Good pace." "Thank you," Marcus replied, leaning back slightly to stretch his cramped shoulders. "Just trying to keep up with everything." "You're handling it." "Just fine. Keep it up." She started to walk away, but then paused, turning back with an expression that had subtly shifted from approval to something more guarded. "Oh, and I almost forgot. Mr. Montgomery wants to see you in his office." "Now?" Marcus blinked in surprise. "Mr. Montgomery?" "Yes," she said simply, offering no further explanation. "He's on the 40th floor. You can head up now." Miss Harper walked away without another word, leaving Marcus frozen in place, his mind racing. Why would James Montgomery want to see him on his first day? This wasn't normal, was it? New hires didn't get summoned by the CEO without reason. He glanced around at his colleagues, but no one seemed to notice his predicament as they continued their work. Marcus made his way to the elevator, his palms growing damp with each step. He tried to steady his breathing, to calm the rapid beating of his heart. This could be good news, couldn't it? Perhaps Montgomery had noticed something impressive in his resume, something that had stood out from the other candidates. Maybe he wanted to personally welcome Marcus to the company. But even as he tried to reassure himself, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered darker possibilities. His mother's words from that morning echoed again. Some places have shadows. When the elevator doors opened on the 40th floor, Marcus stepped into an entirely different atmosphere. The executive level was quieter, more refined, with floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed the space in natural light. Everything about this place exuded importance, from the sleek furniture to the plush carpet underfoot. He approached the receptionist's desk, trying to ignore the knot tightening in his stomach. "I'm here to see Mr. Montgomery. Marcus Banks." The way. Receptionist, a woman with perfect posture and a practiced smile, nodded and gestured toward an imposing set of double doors. "He's expecting you. Go right in." Marcus hesitated momentarily, his nerves now in full rebellious mode, before taking a deep breath and pushing open the doors to James Montgomery's inner sanctum. The office was massive, with a panoramic view of the city skyline that made Marcus feel even smaller than he already did. James sat behind an enormous mahogany desk, his back to the window, reviewing documents with apparent concentration. He didn't look up immediately, and for a moment Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, uncertain of his next move. Finally, James raised his head, his face an unreadable mask. "Marcus, come in. Have a seat." Marcus crossed the room, acutely aware of each step on the thick carpet, and lowered himself into the leather chair opposite the desk. His heart continued its frantic rhythm, each beat a warning he couldn't quite decipher. "So," James began, his voice measured and controlled, "how's your first day going?" Marcus swallowed, willing his voice to remain steady. "Good, sir. I've been working through the reports Miss Harper assigned. Everything's going well." "So far," James nodded, setting the papers aside. His gaze sharpened slightly as he studied Marcus more intently. "That's good to hear." A moment of silence followed, heavy with unspoken thoughts. James leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. There was something unsettling in the way he was looking at him, as though searching for something specific, trying to place him in some mental catalog. Marcus felt the tension growing, expanding to fill the room. "Is there something specific you wanted to discuss, Mr. Montgomery?" James's expression remained unchanged. "You're new here, Marcus, just starting out, but your name caught my attention." Marcus's chest tightened involuntarily. "My name?" "Yes." James's eyes narrowed fractionally before he leaned forward, closing the distance between them by inches. "Banks, isn't it?" Marcus nodded slowly, uncertain where this was heading. "Yes, sir. Marcus Banks." James's gaze lingered on him for another long moment. Then he sat back in his chair, face still unreadable. "It's a strong name. Reminds me of someone I used to know." Marcus's heart thundered in his chest, the sound almost deafening in his ears. Was it possible that James knew? That somehow, in this brief exchange, he had made a connection Marcus himself wasn't yet aware of? But James didn't pursue the matter further. Instead, he offered a faint smile, professional, practiced, never reaching his eyes. "I like to keep track of the new talent joining the company. We expect great things from you, Marcus. Keep up the good work." Marcus forced himself to nod, uncertain what else to say. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." James glanced back at the papers on his desk, a clear dismissal. "Good. You can get back to it then." Marcus stood, his legs feeling strangely unsteady as he made his way toward the door. But just as his hand closed around the handle, James's voice stopped him. "Oh, and Marcus?" Marcus turned, his hand still resting on the door. "Yes?" "If you ever need anything," James said, his tone still professionally cordial but laced with something Marcus couldn't quite identify. "My door is always open." Marcus nodded again, his throat suddenly dry. "I'll keep that in mind." With that, he stepped out of the office, the door closing softly behind him. He stood in the quiet hallway, trying to process what had just transpired. There was no logical reason for James Montgomery to take such an interest in him, no reason for him to call Marcus into his office on his first day, and yet something about the way James had looked at him, the way he had mentioned his name, it felt like more than coincidence, more than routine interest in a new employee. The elevator ride back to his floor seemed interminable. As Marcus returned to his desk, the ambient noise of the office washed over him, but it did little to calm the uneasiness twisting in his gut. His mother had been right. There was something off about this place, something beneath the polished surface. And Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing some crucial piece of information, a key that would unlock the mystery of James Montgomery's peculiar interest in him. The key clicked in the lock as Marcus pushed open the door to the apartment, the familiar sense of home greeting him, Zara's cooking, the faint hint of lavender she used to freshen the space, the ineffable comfort of belonging. It should have been enough to dispel the strange tension that had followed him home after his first day at Montgomery Enterprises, almost, but not quite. He set his briefcase down carefully by the door, loosening his tie as he walked into the living room. Zara was there sitting on the couch with a book open in her lap, though her eyes weren't tracking the words on the page. She looked up when he entered, her expression carefully composed. "How was it?" she asked, her voice calm but with an undercurrent of something Marcus couldn't quite identify. Marcus hesitated, unsure how to describe the day's events, the excitement of beginning a new chapter, the disquieting sense of being observed, of being recognized, James Montgomery's penetrating gaze, and that flicker of what? It had been a whirlwind of emotions, anticipation, confusion, and an inexplicable unease, all intertwined. "It was fine," he said finally, attempting to sound convincing as he sank onto the couch beside her. "Busy. They've got me working on a lot of reports, still getting a feel for the place." Zara nodded slowly, but her gaze lingered on him a moment too long. She wasn't convinced. She knew him too well. "Anything unusual happen?" she asked, the question deceptively casual. Marcus paused, debating how much to share. His mother already seemed on edge about the whole situation, but there was no point in hiding it. Her instincts had already been proven right. Well, actually, I met James Montgomery today. Zara's hand tightened visibly around the edge of her book. You met him? Marcus nodded, the memory of that strange encounter replaying in his mind. Yeah, he called me up to his office. I have no idea why. It was weird. I mean, he's the CEO. Why would he care about some new hire? Zara remained silent, her eyes darkening. As she looked away, Marcus noticed the tension in her posture, the way her shoulders stiffened at the mere mention of James Montgomery. She wasn't surprised, not in the way he would have expected. There was something else going on, something she wasn't telling him. He leaned forward, his voice softening. Mom, what is it? Why are you acting like this? Zara's breath caught audibly, her book forgotten as she set it on the coffee table, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them in her lap. Marcus, she began, her voice barely steady. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago. Marcus frowned, a knot of apprehension forming in his stomach. What do you mean? She closed her eyes momentarily, taking a deep breath before forcing herself to meet his gaze. James Montgomery? He's not just your boss. Marcus's pulse quickened, a cold wave of confusion washing over him. What are you talking about? Zara's eyes met his, filled with regret and a pain so deep it seemed to reach across decades. He's your father, Marcus. For a moment, the words didn't make sense. They were just sounds arranged in an order his brain refused to process. Marcus blinked rapidly, his mind struggling to reconcile what he'd just heard. His father? James Montgomery? The James Montgomery? What? His voice emerged as little more than a whisper. That can't be right. Zara nodded, her voice shaky but determined. It's true. James and we were involved a long time ago. Before you were born. Marcus shook his head vehemently, disbelief crashing through him like a physical force. But you said my father left. You never told me who he was. He stood abruptly, running a hand through his hair as his mind raced in chaotic circles. How could you keep this from me? How could you not tell me? Zara rose too, her hands wringing together in distress. I was trying to protect you, Marcus. I didn't want you to grow up knowing what kind of man he is. What kind of man? Marcus's voice rose, a cocktail of anger and shock fueling each word. You didn't think I deserved to know? To know who my father is? Tears welled in Zara's eyes, but she didn't look away, didn't flinch from his anger. I didn't want you to be hurt. James, he didn't want you. When I told him I was pregnant, he fired me. He cut me off completely. And when I tried to find work elsewhere, he blacklisted me from the entire industry. Marcus froze, the weight of her words settling over him like a shroud. He blacklisted you? Zara nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. Yes, I couldn't get a job afterward. I had no income, no support. It was just you and me, and I had to fight for every dollar, every opportunity. He didn't care. He just wanted me gone, out of his life, and he did everything in his power to ensure I couldn't come back. Marcus's stomach turned violently. The man he had admired from afar, the man he had just met in that imposing office, his father had done this, had abandoned his mother, had left her with nothing, had discarded him before he'd even drawn his first breath. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Marcus asked, his voice quieter now but still laden with hurt. All these years I've wondered about him. I've asked you. But you never said anything. Why now? Zara's face crumpled, and she sank back onto the couch, her hands trembling visibly. I thought I could keep it buried. I didn't want you to ever know what kind of man he is. But when you told me you'd gotten a job at Montgomery Enterprises, she looked up at him, her eyes pleading for understanding. I couldn't keep it from you any longer. You deserve to know the truth, Marcus. I didn't know how to tell you. Marcus stood motionless, staring at her, as a maelstrom of emotion swirled within him, anger, confusion, profound sadness. All these years he'd been kept in the dark, and now everything was unraveling before him with dizzying speed. A wave of nausea rose within him as the full implications crystallized. James Montgomery, his father, had known about him all this time. Not only had he abandoned them, but he had actively worked to destroy his mother's career, her future. "I can't believe this," Marcus said, shaking his head in disbelief. "I've been working for him, sitting in his office like I was just another employee, and all this time he knew." "He doesn't know who you are," Zara said, her voice weak with emotion. "He hasn't made the connection, Marcus. He doesn't recognize you." "That's not the point," Marcus's voice cracked, anger surging within him like a tidal wave. "He abandoned us, Mom. He destroyed your life, and now I'm supposed to just sit there and work for him like nothing happened?" Zara looked up at him, her eyes imploring. "I didn't tell you this to make you hate him. I told you because I didn't want you walking into that place without knowing the truth. I didn't want you getting close to him, only to be hurt all over again." Marcus's chest heaved as he struggled to regulate his breathing. Everything felt like it was spiraling beyond his control. His entire life he had imagined his father as a mystery, a man who had simply walked away. But the truth was infinitely worse, more calculated, more cruel, more deliberately destructive. He paced the room, running his hands over his face as though trying to wipe away the reality before him. "I don't even know what to do now. Do I confront him? Do I quit?" Zara stood, placing a gentle hand on his arm, anchoring him in the storm. "That's your choice, Marcus, but you need to think carefully. James is powerful. He could ruin you just like he ruined me." Marcus met her gaze, the anger still burning in his chest, a flame that refused to be extinguished. "I'm not afraid of him. He can't hurt me like he hurt you." Zara sighed, her face etched with concern. "I just want you to be safe." Marcus stared at her, the weight of everything crashing down around him. He didn't know what his next move would be, but one thing was abundantly clear. He couldn't continue working for James Montgomery as though nothing had happened. He couldn't pretend that the man who had abandoned him and systematically destroyed his mother's life was just another CEO, just another boss to impress. "I'll figure it out," he said finally, his voice tight with barely contained emotion. "But I can't keep working there. Not after this." Zara nodded, her expression softening with understanding. "Whatever you decide, Marcus, I'm with you." Marcus took a deep breath, attempting to calm the tempest raging within. Everything had changed in the span of minutes. The job he had thought would be his big break, his golden opportunity, now felt like a betrayal of everything he believed in. And the man he had admired from afar, his own father, was revealed as a stranger, a man who had inflicted more damage than Marcus could have ever imagined. As he sat down beside his mother again, Marcus felt the weight of this new truth settle into his bones. The life he had known was irrevocably altered, and now he had to decide what to do with the pieces that remained. The subway rumbled beneath Marcus's feet as he stared out the window, his reflection flickering against the darkness of the tunnel. 2 days had passed since his mother had revealed the truth. 2 days since everything he thought he knew about his life had been upended. He still couldn't fully process it. James Montgomery was his father. Marcus's fists clenched involuntarily as the reality settled deeper into his consciousness with each passing moment. His father, the man he'd encountered on his first day at Montgomery Enterprises, had looked at him as though he were nothing more than another faceless employee. The man who had ruined his mother's career, blacklisted her from the industry, and walked away without a backward glance. And now Marcus was working under him, as though none of it had ever happened. The subway screeched to a halt, jolting him from his brooding thoughts. He had to compose himself before arriving at the office, had to mask the turmoil raging within. He couldn't let anyone see how close he was to the breaking point. Not yet. Not until he'd determined his next move. The crisp morning air hit him as he emerged from the station onto the bustling streets of the financial district. Montgomery Enterprises loomed ahead, its sleek glass tower rising against the cloudless sky. Once it had symbolized achievement, the physical manifestation of his ambitions. Now it felt like a prison, trapping him in a perverse game whose rules he'd never agreed to play. The office hummed with its usual energy when Marcus entered. Phones ringing, conversations flowing, keyboards clicking in rhythmic precision. No. One paid him particular attention as he made his way to his desk, which suited him perfectly. He needed time to think, to plan. But the moment he sat down, the full weight of his knowledge crashed over him anew. He opened his laptop, watching the cursor blink expectantly on the screen, but he couldn't focus. Every task seemed pointless, hollow in the shadow of what he now knew. How could he sit here, pretending that everything was normal? How could he work for a man who had abandoned his responsibilities, who had walked away from him and his mother without a second thought? The worst part was that James didn't even recognize him, didn't remember him as anything more than a name on a list of new hires. Marcus had seen it in his eyes during their first meeting, that flicker of recognition quickly dismissed as irrelevant. To James, he was just another face in the crowd, another cog in the machinery of his success. The thought made Marcus's blood boil. He glanced across the office to where James's assistant sat outside his corner office. The door was closed, as it typically was, but Marcus could picture him inside, sitting behind that massive desk, calm and collected, running his empire while the truth of his past remained safely buried. Not for much longer, Marcus thought grimly. He couldn't simply let this go, couldn't sit idle with the weight of this knowledge pressing down on him like a physical burden. But what was his plan? Storm into James's office and declare the truth to the entire company? Confront him publicly? Expose his hypocrisy before everyone? He had considered it, replayed various scenarios in his mind repeatedly over the past 2 days. He'd imagined James's shocked expression, the truth spilling out like floodwaters breaching a dam. But then what? James held all the power, all the influence. He could easily turn the situation against Marcus, just as he had with Zara all those years ago. Marcus stared at his computer screen, the words of the report before him blurring into meaningless patterns. He couldn't act rashly. He needed to be strategic about this. As the morning wore on, Marcus tried to push through the tension, nodding his shoulders. But each time he looked up from his work, the sight of James's office made his skin crawl. The door remained firmly closed, the man inside blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just outside. Lunch came and went, though Marcus barely touched his food. His mind was too occupied, racing with thoughts of what to do next. He couldn't remain at Montgomery Enterprises, not with James as CEO, but he couldn't simply resign either, not without confrontation, not without answers. He needed James to acknowledge what he had done, to face the consequences of his actions. But how? As Marcus returned to his desk after lunch, his phone vibrated in his pocket. Glancing at the screen, he saw a text from his mother. "How are you holding up?" Marcus sighed, typing a quick response, trying to figure it out. He didn't have the heart to tell her how much worse he felt today compared to yesterday. Zara had been visibly worried when he left that morning, her eyes reflecting a fear she had concealed for years. She didn't want him entangled in James's world, didn't want him hurt as she had been. But Marcus couldn't walk away as though nothing had happened. He needed to understand why James had done it, why he had fired Zara, blacklisted her, left them with nothing. And he needed James to comprehend the consequences of his actions, to feel the impact of the choices he had made. The question remained, how to accomplish this without losing everything in the process. As the afternoon dragged on, Marcus's frustration mounted. His work felt mechanical, each task merely a distraction from the fury simmering beneath the surface. He kept his head down, but inside his thoughts were racing toward an inevitable conclusion. Finally, toward the end of the day, Marcus made his decision. He couldn't continue this charade of normalcy. He had to confront James face to face. No games, no pretense. But he couldn't do it here, in the middle of the office, where James held all the cards. He needed to catch James off guard, in a setting where the usual power dynamics were disrupted, where James couldn't hide behind his corporate facade. Marcus stood from his desk, his heart pounding with determination. He needed a plan, needed to catch James somewhere outside the office, somewhere he could speak freely without fear of immediate repercussions. As he gathered his belongings, an idea began to take shape. Earlier that day, he had overheard some senior staff discussing James's dinner plans. Apparently, James and his family often dined at an upscale restaurant not far from the office, a place where they could be seen, where James could subtly showcase his success to those who mattered in his carefully curated world. Marcus's jaw tightened. That would be his opportunity to appear unannounced and confront James in front of the people he cared about most. He would make James face the truth, force him to acknowledge his past actions toward Zara and Marcus, and he would do it where? James couldn't hide behind the protection of his office, his company, his carefully constructed image. The plan wasn't perfect, but it gave Marcus purpose, a channel for the anger that had been consuming him since learning the truth. He couldn't wait any longer. He couldn't allow James to continue living his lie. That evening, Marcus sat on the subway, the lights flickering overhead as the train hurtled through dark tunnels. His hands were clenched into fists in his lap, his mind fixed on what lay ahead. He was nervous. Of course he was. He didn't know how James would react, didn't know if this confrontation would backfire catastrophically, but he didn't care. He had to do this, couldn't let James escape the consequences of his actions without at least facing them directly. When he reached the restaurant, it was exactly as he had imagined. An elegant establishment with large windows and soft lighting. The kind of place where people went not just to dine, but to be seen dining. As Marcus stood outside observing the patrons within, he spotted James immediately. James sat at a table near the window, his wife, Victoria, beside him, their son, Nathan, across from them. They were laughing, enjoying their evening, completely oblivious to the storm about to break over them. Marcus's heart raced as he stepped through the door, his focus narrowing to a single point, making James Montgomery finally see him for who he truly was, not just another employee, but the son he had abandoned. He approached the table steadily, the ambient noise of the restaurant fading into the background with each step. James didn't notice him at first, too engaged in conversation with Victoria, gesturing animatedly as he recounted some anecdote. But then, as Marcus drew closer, James's eyes lifted and froze. The recognition was instantaneous, not of Marcus as his son, but as the unexpected intrusion of work into his private life. James's face tightened, his smile fading as he locked eyes with Marcus. For a brief moment there was only silence, tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus stopped. At the edge of the table, his heart hammering against his ribcage. This was it, the moment when everything would come crashing down, when the carefully constructed lies would finally crumble. The restaurant buzzed with the quiet hum of conversation, silverware clinking against fine china, wine glasses being raised in toasts. It was a place of refinement and discretion, where voices were never raised and scenes were never made. Marcus stood at the entrance, his heart racing as he watched the man who had once been nothing more than a distant question. Mark Butt was now terrifyingly real. James Montgomery sat at the corner table, his back to the window, the city lights creating a halo effect behind him. Victoria sat beside him, her perfectly styled hair gleaming under the chandeliers. Across from them was Nathan, their son, looking every inch the young man being groomed for succession. They were laughing together, a picture of family harmony, completely unaware of the approaching storm. Marcus swallowed hard, his palms damp with anticipation. This was the moment he had been building toward, but now that he was here, doubt began to creep into the edges of his consciousness. His fingers twitched at his sides as he approached their table, each step feeling heavier than the last. James looked up first. Their eyes locked across the intervening space, and Marcus saw it instantly. The flicker of recognition, followed immediately by the tightening of James's jaw. The easy smile that had graced his face moments before vanished, replaced by something colder, something that couldn't be concealed behind social niceties. For a suspended moment, neither of them moved. Marcus's heart thundered in his chest, and James's eyes hardened, his body tensing as though bracing for impact. Marcus reached the table, standing just a foot away, his presence casting a metaphorical shadow over their perfect family dinner. "Marcus," James said, his voice low and controlled, his eyes darting quickly between his wife and son before returning to Marcus. "What are you doing here?" Marcus felt his pulse quicken. James's tone wasn't welcoming. It was defensive, wary. He glanced briefly at Victoria and Nathan, who were now staring at him with undisguised confusion. "I'm here for the same reason you are, James," Marcus said, his voice steady, despite the tension coursing through him. "Dinner." Victoria raised an eyebrow, turning toward her husband with growing suspicion. "James, is this someone from the office?" James cleared his throat, his expression tightening further. "Yes, Marcus is a new employee." "A new employee?" Victoria repeated, her eyes shifting between Marcus and James, clearly sensing the undercurrent of something deeper than a workplace connection. Nathan, sitting across the table, leaned forward, eyeing Marcus with growing curiosity. "Doesn't seem like a typical work meeting, Dad. What's going on?" Marcus clenched his fists at his sides, his chest constricting with the weight of everything left unsaid. He could feel James's gaze burning into him, a silent plea to retreat, to walk away from this confrontation, but Marcus had come too far to turn back now. "I'm not here about work," Marcus said, his voice firmer this time, directed squarely at James. "I'm here about something that happened a long time ago." James's expression darkened, his shoulders squaring defensively. For the first time, Marcus glimpsed something like fear flickering in his eyes, the fear of exposure, of past sins brought to light. Victoria, sensing the shift in atmosphere, leaned closer to her husband, concern etching lines in her forehead. "James," she asked quietly, "what is he talking about?" James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached for his wine glass, his hand steady, but his grip betraying tension. He took a measured sip, his gaze never leaving Marcus's face. "This isn't the time or place for whatever this is, Marcus." But Marcus ignored the implicit warning. His eyes moved from Victoria to Nathan before settling back on James with renewed intensity. "I think it's exactly the time and place." There was a long, pregnant pause, the kind that stretches too far, like the moment before a storm breaks after days of gathering clouds. "You know who I am, don't you?" Marcus asked, his voice lowered, but filled with barely controlled anger. James's jaw clenched visibly, his eyes flashing with something Marcus recognized now as panic, the cornered fear of a man whose carefully constructed world was on the verge of collapse. "Marcus," James said quietly, struggling to maintain control of the situation, "we can discuss this another time." "No," Marcus countered, his voice rising slightly. "We'll talk about it now." "In front of them," Nathan frowned, glancing at his father with growing concern. "Dad, what's he talking about?" Victoria's hand moved to rest on James's arm, her features tight with worry. "James, what's going on? Why does he seem so angry?" James's face remained impassive, his eyes locked on Marcus, but the tension in his posture betrayed him. He didn't want this conversation to happen here, didn't want his carefully guarded secrets exposed to the light of day. His resistance only strengthened Marcus's resolve. Marcus took a steadying breath, centering himself for what came next. "I'm not just some new employee at your company. I'm the son you abandoned." Victoria's eyes widened in shock, her hand freezing in place. "What?" Nathan's expression transformed from confusion to disbelief, his mouth parting slightly as he looked from Marcus to his father in rapid succession. James remained silent, his face paling noticeably, but his jaw remained clenched tight. He didn't deny it, he couldn't. His silence Was confirmation enough? Marcus took another step closer to the table, his voice shaking with barely controlled emotion. 24 years ago, you fired my mother. You blacklisted her from the industry. You left her with nothing, and you walked away. And now I'm standing here working for you, while you sit here pretending none of it ever happened. Victoria's hand moved to cover her mouth, her eyes wide with dawning horror. James, is this true? Nathan's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing as he stared at his father. Dad, what is he talking about? James said nothing, the weight of truth hanging in the air between them, too heavy to dismiss, too real to deny. His continued silence was the only answer any of them needed. Victoria's eyes filled with tears, her voice trembling as she looked at her husband of many years. You have another child? You did this to someone and you never told me? Marcus felt the knot in his chest loosen fractionally as the truth finally began to fracture James's carefully constructed reality. He looked at James, his anger giving way to something that surprised him, something almost like pity for the man trapped in the web of his own deceptions. You ruined her life, Marcus continued, his voice quieter now, more controlled. You left us with nothing, and you thought you could just continue living as though none of it ever happened. James's face had drained of all color. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words emerged. For the first time, Marcus saw him not as the powerful CEO he had always appeared to be, but as a man caught in the inevitable collapse of his own lies. Victoria's voice broke through the tension, barely above a whisper. James, how could you? James finally spoke, but his voice was hoarse, weakened by the weight of exposure. I made a mistake. You didn't think, Marcus said, finishing the unspoken thought, it would come back to you. But it did. Nathan's face had hardened, anger flashing in his eyes as he stared at his father with newfound disgust. Dad, you seriously did this? You have a son you never told us about? James's hand trembled visibly as he set his glass down, his eyes moving. Between his family and Marcus, trapped in a moment he could no longer control. I thought it was over. I didn't want to hurt anyone. Marcus shook his head, bitterness seeping into his voice. It's never over, James. You hurt my mother. You hurt me. And now you're going to have to face that. For a moment, no one spoke. The restaurant's ambient noise seemed to recede, leaving only the weight of truth suspended in the air between them. Victoria's tears fell silently, her gaze fixed on the man she thought she knew. Nathan's hands had clenched into fists on the table, his knuckles white with rage. James's eyes finally met Marcus's again, and this time there was no more denial, no more evasion, only the heavy burden of a past that had finally caught up with him. The restaurant felt suddenly cold, the soft glow of the chandeliers casting long shadows over the table. The hum of conversation continued around them, but at the Montgomery's table, time seemed to have stopped completely. Victoria wiped away her tears, her hand trembling as she placed it on the table. James, she whispered, her voice thick with disbelief, you've been lying to me, to us, for all these years. James sat motionless, the color drained from his face as he stared at the wine glass before him. His hands, once so steady and sure, trembled slightly. He looked smaller somehow, as though the weight of his deception had physically diminished him. You have another son, Nathan said, his voice tight with anger. You ruined someone's life and thought we'd never find out? Marcus stood at the edge of the table, his chest rising and falling rapidly with the cascade of emotions flowing through him. Rage, hurt, and something like vindication. The truth was finally exposed, laid bare for all to see. James could no longer hide behind his wealth or power. He couldn't pretend any more. James's eyes flickered briefly to Marcus before returning to his wife and son. I didn't want to hurt you, he began, his voice hoarse and unfamiliar. I thought it was over. It was a mistake, a long time ago. A mistake? Marcus's voice cut through the tension like a knife. You didn't just make a mistake. You destroyed my mother's life. You blacklisted her, left her with nothing. Victoria gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. You blacklisted her? James, how could you do something like that? James's composed mask, the one he had worn for decades, crumbled before their eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but words failed him. He looked cornered, trapped by the consequences of choices made long ago, choices he had believed were safely buried in the past. I had no choice, James finally said, his voice low and pleading. I couldn't let it come out. I had a family, a career. I had to protect everything I'd built. Nathan stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. So you protected yourself and left them to suffer? His voice dripped with disgust. You didn't care about them. You only cared about your reputation. Marcus watched as the man who had seemed untouchable, invincible, now looked utterly defeated. James's hands shook as he reached again for his glass, taking a long drink as though seeking courage from the wine. His gaze was unfocused, as if he couldn't bear to meet anyone's eyes directly. Victoria's tears continued to fall silently as she shook her head in disbelief. I trusted you, James. I built a life with you. How could you lie to me like this? How could you do this to your own child? The word child hung in the air, its weight settling heavily over the table. James's face contorted with guilt, his eyes finally rising to meet Victoria's. I didn't know how to tell you, he admitted, his voice breaking. I thought if I buried it, it would go away, that I could protect you from it. Victoria let out a bitter laugh, her voice cracking. With emotion, protect me from the truth? You didn't protect anyone, James. You just protected yourself. Marcus stood firm, his fists still clenched at his sides. You thought you could just erase us, pretend we didn't exist, but we do, James. We're real, and we've been living with the consequences of your choices every day. James's eyes flickered with what might have been shame, but it came too late to mean anything. He had lived his life in comfort and privilege, building an empire, while Zara had struggled to raise Marcus alone. There was no excuse, no justification that could possibly make up for what he had done. Nathan's face was hard, his voice dripping with newfound contempt for his father. You lied to us, Dad. You built this perfect image, but it's all a lie, isn't it? How many other secrets are there? How many other people have you hurt? James shook his head, his voice barely audible. There's no one else, I swear. Do you expect us to believe you? Victoria asked, her voice breaking again as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. After all this, you've been lying to me for over 20 years, James. I don't even know who you are anymore. Marcus felt a twist of empathy for Victoria's pain. She had been caught in the middle of this, completely unaware of the life her husband had abandoned. But he couldn't allow himself to feel pity for her, not yet. She was just as much a victim of James's deception as he and his mother had been. But there was still so much she didn't understand. You're not the only one he hurt, Marcus said quietly, his voice filled with cold anger. My mother, Zara, she tried to get back on her feet after James fired her. She tried to find work, but everywhere she went, doors were closed to her. He blacklisted her, destroyed her reputation. We struggled for years while he sat here, living as though nothing had happened. Victoria's face crumpled as the full impact of Marcus's words registered. She turned to James, her voice barely above a whisper. You did that to her? You ruined her life just to protect your own? James's hands trembled visibly as he set his glass down, his eyes reflecting a guilt that was decades too late. I didn't know what else to do, he said weakly. I was scared. Scared? Nathan spat, his voice rising dangerously. That's your excuse? Marcus felt the rage building inside him again, but now it wasn't just for himself, it was for his mother, for all. The years she had struggled, for all the sacrifices she had made just to keep them afloat. James's fear had cost them everything. You don't get to be scared, Marcus said, his voice trembling with emotion. You didn't lose everything. We did. James looked up at Marcus, his eyes reflecting something that almost resembled genuine remorse. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words hollow and inadequate. "I'm so sorry." But Marcus wasn't interested in apologies, not now, not after everything that had transpired. "Sorry doesn't change anything," he said coldly. "It doesn't fix what you did. You don't get to say sorry and walk away." James opened his mouth to respond, but Victoria cut him off, her voice shaking with newfound anger. "Marcus is right. You don't get to fix this with an apology, James. You lied to us, and you destroyed their lives." She turned to Marcus, her expression softening as fresh tears welled in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Marcus. I didn't know. I didn't know any of this." Marcus looked at her, his anger still simmering beneath the surface, but he nodded in acknowledgement. "I know. This isn't your fault." Nathan, who had been silent for a moment, spoke again, his voice filled with disbelief. "So what now? What are we supposed to do with this, Dad? Pretend like nothing happened?" James didn't respond. He stared down at the table, his hands shaking, his face ashen. The man who had once seemed so powerful, so untouchable, was now reduced to a shell of his former self, unable to answer for the choices that had finally caught up with him. "We can't pretend anymore," Victoria said quietly, her voice filled with resignation. "We have to face this." Marcus's chest tightened as he watched James, this man who had caused so much damage, sitting in silence, unable to offer any defense, for his actions. The truth had finally emerged, and now the family he had built on lies was crumbling around him. "I've said what I needed to say," Marcus said, his voice steady but cold. "Now it's up to you to decide how to deal with it." Victoria's tears fell freely now, and even Nathan, who had been filled with righteous anger moments ago, looked lost and bewildered. The weight of James's betrayal had shattered their familydom, and there was no going back to what had been before. James finally looked up, his voice barely a whisper. I'll fix this. I'll make it right." But Marcus shook his head firmly. "You can't fix this, James. You can't undo what you've done." With that, he turned away from the table, leaving them to grapple with the truth he had laid bare. As he walked out of the restaurant, the weight on his chest seemed to lighten fractionally. The confrontation was over, and the truth had finally been spoken aloud. But the damage had been done long ago, and there was no turning back to what might have been. The atmosphere at Montgomery Enterprises had shifted perceptibly. Conversations that were typically professional and restrained now carried an edge of speculation. Eyes darted repeatedly toward James Montgomery's office, the glass walls seemingly more transparent than before, as though everyone within the building could detect the cracks forming in the foundation of the empire. Marcus sat at his desk, observing the movement of people around him. News had spread with surprising speed, and now whispers had evolved into open discussions. Everyone knew James Montgomery, the untouchable CEO, the man whose name graced the building, was no longer invulnerable. Marcus stared at the report before him, the words blurring into meaninglessness. He should have felt some sense of satisfaction knowing that the man who had devastated his mother's life was finally facing consequences. But instead, there was a curious emptiness within him. The anger that had propelled him to confront James no longer burned as fiercely. Now there was only the aftermath to contend with. His phone vibrated, breaking his contemplation. A text from his mother. "How are you?" Marcus sighed, typing a brief response. "It's all over the office now. Everyone knows." Her reply came almost instantly. "Are you okay?" He hesitated before responding. "I think so. Just trying to figure out what comes next." Marcus leaned back in his chair, glancing toward the far end of the office, where James's door remained conspicuously closed. No one had seen him arrive that morning, and rumors were already circulating. Some speculated he was secluded in his home, avoiding public scrutiny. Others suggested he was meeting with lawyers, attempting to salvage what remained of his reputation. It didn't matter anymore. The truth was out, and there was no retreating from it. By noon, Marcus's phone vibrated again, this time with a company-wide email. The subject line was simple: company announcement. His heart accelerated as he opened the message. Dear team, effective immediately, James Montgomery has stepped down from his role as CEO of Montgomery Enterprises. The board of directors has appointed an interim CEO while the company transitions. Through this period, we remain committed to our values and will continue to uphold the integrity and reputation of the company. Thank you for your continued dedication during this time. Marcus's hand tightened around his phone as the implications registered. It was done. James was gone. For a moment, he simply sat there, staring at the screen, allowing the words to penetrate. The man who had wielded so much power, who had made decisions that destroyed lives without apparent remorse, had finally lost his position at the summit. But it wasn't the victory Marcus had envisioned. He had pictured this moment repeatedly, James's downfall, his public humiliation. But now that it was reality, it felt hollow, devoid of the satisfaction he had anticipated. His phone vibrated once more, another message from his mother. I just saw the news. Are you okay with this? He stared at her question for several seconds before replying, yeah, he's done. But it doesn't feel like I thought it would. Her response came more slowly this time, more measured. It won't feel like you expected, Marcus, but you did what you had to do. You faced him. That's what matters. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, allowing her words to settle over him. She was right. He had done what was necessary. The truth was exposed, and James was gone. But the cost of it all still weighed heavily upon him. Later that afternoon, the whispers around the office had escalated into open discussions. Marcus kept his head down, avoiding the curious glances some colleagues cast in his direction. He didn't want to become the focal point of office gossip. He simply wanted to navigate through the day. But as the hours passed, Marcus knew he couldn't evade reality indefinitely. Eventually, he would have to confront the aftermath of what had transpired, not just what had happened to James, but what it meant for his own future. He had invested so much energy in building toward that moment of confrontation, had spent so long imagining how it would feel to finally make James Montgomery answer for his actions. But now that it was over, Marcus was left with the fallout and uncertain of his path forward. A gentle knock on his desk interrupted his thoughts. Looking up, he found Miss Harper standing there, her expression unreadable. "Can we talk for a minute?" she asked, her voice calm but serious. Marcus nodded, following her to a quiet conference room at the rear of the office. The space was modest, with glass walls that provided a clear view of the bustling floor outside. Miss Harper closed the door behind them, folding her arms across her chest as she leaned against the table. "So," she began, her tone measured. "I'm sure you've seen the news?" Marcus nodded silently, uncertain where this conversation was heading. "I know about your connection to James," she continued, watching him carefully. "Word travels quickly in places like this." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected this level of transparency so soon. "You do?" Miss Harper nodded slowly. "I don't know all the details, but people are talking. The confrontation at the restaurant wasn't exactly private." Marcus's stomach dropped as the realization dawned on him. The restaurant had been crowded, filled with people who were likely as interested in gossip as they were in their meals. Of course, word would spread like wildfire. "I didn't mean for it to become public knowledge," Marcus said quietly. I needed to confront him about what he did." Miss Harper nodded, her expression softening slightly. "I understand. I don't blame you. But you need to be careful, Marcus. This company is undergoing significant changes with James stepping down. There will be intense scrutiny from all sides. People will be watching you closely." Marcus swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling on him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you need to decide what you want to do," she said quietly. "Staying here? Working at the company your father built? It's going to present challenges. People will ask questions and they'll expect answers. Marcus stared at her, his mind racing through implications he hadn't fully considered. He had been, so focused on confronting James, on forcing him to acknowledge the truth, that he hadn't thought much about the aftermath. Working here, remaining in the shadow of his father's legacy, it wasn't just about the job anymore. It was about identity, about the narrative he wanted to create for himself. "You don't need to decide immediately," Miss Harper added, her voice gentler now. "But think about it. This place is changing, and you need to determine if you want to be part of that transformation." Marcus nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. "Thank you. I'll consider it carefully." Miss Harper gave him a brief nod before leaving the room, allowing Marcus space to process his thoughts alone. By the time Marcus left the office that evening, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city streets. He walked slowly, his mind heavy with everything that had transpired. James was gone, forced out by the truth Marcus had exposed. But now Marcus faced a choice. Could he remain at Montgomery Enterprises, knowing the history behind the companies? Success? Or was it time to step away, to leave his father's shadow behind and forge a new path? He didn't have an answer yet. All he knew was that the truth had irrevocably altered everything, and now he had to determine where he stood in the aftermath of revelation. As he approached his apartment, Marcus's phone vibrated once more. Another message from his mother. "Come home. We'll figure this out together." Marcus smiled faintly, feeling the weight on his chest lighten incrementally. He had confronted the past. Now it was time to decide what kind of future he wanted to build. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by the familiar comfort of his mother's apartment. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the soft murmur of the radio in the background. It was a moment of tranquility, though. The weight of recent events still lingered palpably around them. Zara stood at the stove, her back to him as she stirred a pot of oatmeal. She hadn't said much since he'd returned home the previous evening, and Marcus knew she was waiting for him to share what had happened, waiting to hear what he planned to do next. He hadn't figured that out yet, but here, in this small, familiar space, the world didn't seem quite so overwhelming. Zara set the pot aside and turned to face him, wiping her hands on a dishcloth. "Do you want to talk about it?" Marcus looked up at her, the weariness in his bones impossible to conceal. He stepped down. "James is gone. The company announced it yesterday." Zara's eyes softened as she sat across from him, her expression a mixture of concern and relief. "I heard. It's all over the news. They're calling it a scandal." Marcus nodded, rubbing his hands together as he searched for the right words. "It doesn't feel like I thought it would, Mom. I thought I'd feel, I don't know, relief maybe, satisfaction, but I don't." Zara reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. "That's because this isn't just about him. It's about everything we went through. And nothing he does now can undo what happened." Marcus looked down at her hand, the lines of resilience etched into her skin, the quiet strength that had carried her through years of struggle. She had endured so much, shouldered burdens that would have broken others, and now, even with James removed from power, the scars of the past remained. "I don't know what to do next," Marcus admitted, his voice barely audible. "Staying at the company feels wrong, but leaving, I'm not sure that's the answer either." Zara nodded, understanding reflected in her eyes. "You don't have to decide everything right now, Marcus. You've already done the hardest part. You faced him. You made him own what he did." Marcus swallowed hard, the memory of that confrontation still vivid in his mind. "I keep thinking about all those years, all the times I asked about my father, and you couldn't tell me the truth. And now that I know, it feels like it wasn't worth the pain." Zara's expression softened further, and she leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "It was worth it, Marcus. You deserved to know the truth. And no matter how painful it was, you needed to hear it. Marcus exhaled shakily, the weight of her words settling over him. She was right. Even though the truth had shattered the image of the father he had constructed in his imagination, it was still his truth. And now, with everything exposed, he could finally begin moving forward with clear vision. "I just don't know where to go from here," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. Zara's hand tightened around his reassuringly. "You're stronger than you realize, Marcus. You've weathered this storm, and you've emerged on the other side. Now you get to decide what happens next. You get to build the life you want without anyone holding you back." Marcus met her gaze, and for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope ignite within him. It wasn't much, just a spark, but it was something to build upon. "You're right," he said softly. "I can move beyond this." Zara smiled, a small, tired smile, but one that held a lifetime of resilience. "We both can." The day passed slowly, filled with quiet moments of connection. Marcus remained with his mother, helping around the apartment, cooking dinner together, sharing stories about anything and everything except James Montgomery. For the first time in what felt like forever, they allowed themselves to exist in the present without the shadow of the past looming over them. Later that evening, as they sat on the couch watching a rerun of an old sitcom, Marcus turned to Zara, voicing the question that had been circling in his mind throughout the day. "Do you think we'll ever get real justice for what he did?" he asked quietly. Zara's gaze remained fixed on the television, her face thoughtful. "We already have, in a way." Marcus frowned, puzzled by her response. "What do you mean?" She turned to him, her expression calm yet resolute. "Justice isn't always about punishment, Marcus. Sometimes it's about survival. James may have destroyed my career, but he didn't destroy me. I raised you. We survived, and now we're stronger than we ever would have been if he'd remained in our lives." Marcus stared at her, the profound truth of her words resonating deeply. She was right. They had survived despite everything James had done, despite the obstacles he had placed in their path. They had built a life together. It hadn't been easy, and it certainly hadn't been fair, but they had persevered. "Justice isn't just about seeing him fall," Zara continued, her voice steady and sure. "It's about us standing tall. And we're still standing." Marcus felt emotion rise in his throat, too complex to articulate. He had been fixated on the idea of bringing James down, of making him pay for his actions. But sitting here with his mother, he realized that the true victory lay in their resilience, in their refusal to be defined by abandonment. "I guess you're right," Marcus said softly, a small smile forming. "We're still here." Zara squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with pride. "And we always will be." The next morning, Marcus woke feeling lighter than he had in days. The burden of the past remained, but it no longer felt suffocating. He stood in the kitchen, preparing coffee as early morning light streamed through the window. The world outside was quiet, peaceful, full of possibility. As he poured cups for himself and his mother, Marcus contemplated the choices before him. He could remain at Montgomery Enterprises, but the more he considered it, the more he recognized that the company represented everything he needed to leave behind. It was James's legacy, not his own. He needed a fresh start, an opportunity to build something authentic, untainted by the shadow of his father's history. Zara entered the kitchen, still in her robe, and smiled when she saw him. "Morning," she said, her voice soft with affection. "Morning," Marcus replied, handing her a steaming cup. They sat at the table together, the quiet stillness of dawn enveloping them. For a long time, they simply existed in comfortable silence, no words necessary between them. Finally, Marcus broke the tranquility. "I think I'm going to leave Montgomery Enterprises." Zara looked at him, her expression calm but supportive. "You, don't have to make that decision right now." "I know," Marcus said, taking a sip of his coffee. "But I think it's the right move. I can't stay there, working in the shadow of what he created. I need to do something else, something that's mine. Zara nodded, pride illuminating her features. I think that's a good decision, Marcus smiled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. Yeah, it is. They continued talking, discussing the future, exploring possibilities that now seemed within reach. For the first time in years, Marcus felt genuine control over his own destiny. The past would always be part of his story, but it no longer held the power to define him. He had confronted his father, had uncovered the truth, and now he was free to construct the life he wanted, one shaped by his own choices, not by James's mistakes. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, Marcus looked at his mother, his heart filled with gratitude for everything they had endured together. "We made it," he said quietly, a small smile playing on his lips. Zara smiled back, her eyes reflecting love and unshakable pride. "Yes, we did.